calling Chris Anderson not in London. You're not in London.
I'm not. This is the other Chris Anderson. This is the Chris Anderson in New York calling Rick in Chicago.
Well, it's greetings, Chris Anderson in York. What are you doing in York, England?
Well, this might seem odd to many people, but I'm here on holiday. We're here taking my retirement fund around universities in the north of England, looking at potential places to go to college. And so University of York is one of them. So we're here to check it out.
So Chris Anderson is live from York, England, but I'm holding down the fort here in Chicago. And we want to welcome you to History Happy Hour, the place where history is always on tap. Get it, Chris? And we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube page. And all of our shows are archived on our webpage. And we're running the webpage down below the screen. So if it runs enough times, you'll be able to copy it down and go there. So that was sort of the goal with that. All I know about York, Chris, where you're joining us from, is the Duke of York and his 10,000 men.
Yes, but it didn't happen here.
Where?
It happened in the Netherlands. We marched up the hill and then right back down again, yes.
And is the Ghost Army ever been in New York? Doug McCord wants to know.
It wanted to be.
In Old York. I guess that's Old York as opposed to New York.
Yes, well, the Romans christened, or I don't even christened, but appointed an emperor here in York, Constantine, who later, made the Romans all Christian, I think. They built a really big church. Really big. Huge.
Excellent. We want to thank everybody joining us, whether you're in Luxembourg or whether you're in Rhode Island and your name is George, whether you're in Irving, Texas, or Asheville, North Carolina, or the Hudson Valley of New York. And we appreciate everybody being here with us. It's always a good time. So are we almost ready, Chris, to get started with the show, you think?
I believe so. I mean, we're always ready, Rick.
Well, okay. So let me cue the director. Roll the open. This is one of those no bell days.
No?
The bell is in the other room. Bing.
Oh, Rick.
Well, the bar is open nonetheless here on History Happy Hour, and we appreciate your being here with us. I will say, Chris, you're in York, and things are going well there. I'm in Chicago, and they turned the water off in our building.
Really? So
yeah.
Things are not going well there.
Well, a pump apparently exploded. So I may look clean, but believe me, it's only, an impression. The reality is far, far different.
So do you have to run down to the basement when you need to go to the bathroom? What floor do you live on?
Go to the bathroom. Yeah, so there's always the balcony. But anyway, our topic today is an unusual and little-known anti-Nazi resistance unit that operated in the heart of Berlin. And I think most Americans know nothing about this group of folks. And they're better known in Germany, but there's been a fair amount of misinformation about them there over the years as well. And our guest today is going to fill us in on the real story. And he's been rushing, I know, to get to his computer, and he just popped up and he's joining us. So I'm going to introduce our guest today, Norman Ohler. He is an award-winning novelist, screenwriter, and journalist. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Blitz, Drugs in the Third Reich, and his new book is called The Bohemians, put the title up here, The Lovers Who Led Germany's Resistance Against the Nazis. And he lives in Berlin, but he's taunting us today by joining us from Venice, Italy. Norman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be on your show, Rick.
Excellent. We are so pleased to have you here with us. We're having a little bit of problem with your visual, but we can hear you okay, and I think we'll we'll keep going with that. If there's any continued technical problems and you have to drop out and rejoin us, we'll understand. Norman, let me start out by asking you, your book tells the story of a circle of friends in wartime Berlin who begin to engage in various kinds of resistance against the Nazis. And at the center of this group, which you describe, I think correctly, as enigmatic, it's kind of an unusual group of people, there's a striking young couple. So can you introduce us to them and to the story and tell us what inspired you to want to write about this?
Well, I think my image is frozen right now. And when I grew up as a teenager, the discussion around Nazi Germany was pretty frozen too. I remember how I talked to my grandfather, and he was pretty straightforward actually at one point in telling me that he witnessed quite a lot of things, but he was completely frozen in his actions or in his behavior. And he said, I never did anything, even though I saw everything was wrong. So I was interested actually in people who did something when they realized that things go wrong. And by chance, I found documents from Harro Schulze-Boysen, that's the full name, Harro in English, where he describes his resistance activities against the Nazis. And I became quite interested in the guy because I'd never heard about him. And he had actually, as I learned then through my research, formed the largest resistance network against the Nazis, starting already in 1933, going all the way until 1942. So he was active in the resistance for 9 years, and he had, towards the end, over 150 friends around him that helped him, and half of them were women. They were young, basically young, intelligent people who didn't want to be quiet in those dark times. So I thought that's an interesting story. What did they do? Who were they? How did they live in Berlin at the time? These were questions that interested me.
And although your image is frozen, your audio is coming through loud and clear. So we will.
Better that my image is frozen. I look better in frozen images than if I move.
Well, we thought maybe you were just a very disciplined,
very German,
personality.
Yeah, I'm actually. It's not frozen. I'm just very still right now. It's discipline. You're right. Like Harro. Harro also had great discipline. He was actually your typical German. He was blue-eyed. He was blonde. He was good-looking. He was intelligent. He was cultured. He was everything the Nazis always aspired to be, but never were. He actually was your idealistic German, and for him, that also meant that he was open to discussion to all sides. That's why he was so against the Nazis, because he realized the Nazis are actually closed-minded, small-minded thinking people that were afraid of the other, that wanted to exclude the other, and he was always for including the other.
Chris?
Well, I was going to say, when you were describing Harro, and then
we've lost him. He's dropped out, so we'll wait for him to come back.
Okay.
We forgive you, Norman.
Hey, look at that!
Look, he's real. He's a real person.
That's why I restarted. So I was invisible for a moment, but now I'm even more.
I thought you just didn't like Chris's question, and so that we'd understand.
I didn't hear it, but I can still answer to it if you want me to.
No, but we didn't, because you were frozen. We didn't ask you what cocktail you've brought to History Happy Hour.
Oh, just LSD.
Okay.
You did write Blitz.
You did write Blitz. Well, I'm going with my stein of beer, and I think even though Chris is in England and he's drinking wine, I don't even understand that.
It looks like a water, but you don't want to know what's inside.
Chris, go ahead.
So I'm now frozen again.
Yeah.
I'm frozen drinking the LSD water. No, I'm in Venice, so I would drink an Aperol Spritz or I would drink a Campari, but I
nice.
got here from the restaurant. The restaurant took too long, so I'm still digesting the drinks I had in the restaurant.
You're in
Okay.
Italy. You're in Italy. You're not in Germany anymore. So
That's right. Yeah.
So Norman, could you talk a little bit about how and then Libertas kind of got to the point where they were actively resisting? Because one of the things that I found intriguing in the book was his evolution, his intellectual evolution to get him to that point. Because you talk about him being involved in various other movements and you know, kind of arriving at this point where he's like, this is bad, this is wrong. But it wasn't, he didn't just wake up one morning and say, okay, no.
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand that in the beginning, in the first weeks of the dictatorship, people didn't really realize that, you know, that it's going to be such a bad dictatorship, because we had a lot of government changes in Germany in the 30s, and then in 33 suddenly it was Hitler, so no one really believed that he would stay chancellor for 12 years. So Harro also didn't change his behavior much when Hitler became chancellor. He had been the editor-in-chief of leftist. I don't know if leftist is the right word, but it was a democratic newspaper called the Gegner, the opponents, and everyone was allowed to publish in the opponents, left-wing people, also right-wing people, patriots, artists, free thinkers. So he didn't close down the magazine when Hitler became chancellor, and then in April, 2 months into the Nazi regime, he was arrested for still operating a freewheeling magazine, and he was actually treated quite badly by the SS. His best friend Henry Erlanger, a half-Jewish journalist that worked for the magazine, got killed in those 3 nights that the 2 men were captured by the SS. And after that, Harro realized that with this regime, communication is no longer possible. So he was thinking, what can I do now? I can leave the country like so many people did, especially writers. Many writers left the country. Or I can stay and try to do something from within, which is what some other people did, and this is also what Harro did. So he was trying to figure out what's the best way I can resist against this regime, and his idea in a way was to infiltrate the regime. That's why the book in the UK is called The Infiltrators, while in the US it's called The Bohemians. Both titles are quite good and quite accurate, because he was a Bohemian and an infiltrator at the same time. He infiltrated the Luftwaffe, which is the Air Force. He was working in the Air Force Ministry, Goering's huge bureaucracy, actually, in the center of Berlin. It was a huge office. It still stands today, and today it's the Finance Ministry of Germany. Back then it was the Air Force Ministry. And he was trying to rise in the Air Force Ministry in order to learn as much as he could about the war plans of Germany, because he was convinced that fascism eventually leads to war. He thought so already in 1933 or 34. He thought this regime is heading for war. So he wanted to learn information that he could possibly pass on to Hitler's enemies, which is what he did later on. So he had quite a good plan that he followed straight through. And Libertas, the love of his life, that he met in 1934 on the Wannsee, a big lake in Berlin where they were sailing. She actually helped him to climb the career ladder in the Air Force Ministry, because she's from an aristocratic family, and the estate where she grew up in is the neighboring estate to Goering's estate. So Goering and her family, they were neighbors and quite friendly. And at one point in 1935, Goering was hunting at the castle where Libertas had grown up. So she went back home and she met Goering, and she told him, my husband, they were married then already, my husband trying to make a career in the Air Force Ministry, but he can't really climb up as fast as he would like to. We all know he had some problems with the SS in 1933, but this is long gone. He's now, on the right track. Can't you help him become an officer? So she tricked Goering, because obviously she knew that Harro was up to no good, basically, when it came to National Socialism. But Goering was charmed by her, but she was quite good looking and smart, and so he actually made it happen that Harro could climb into higher ranks in the Air Force Ministry. So that this was one of their ways to harm the system, by gathering sensitive information and then later on passing it on to the Soviet Union and to the British intelligence services.
Well, one of the things I found really interesting was that not only were they kind of intellectually opposed to the Nazis and create flyers, and you talk about that scene where they're putting stickers up to try to let the German people know how corrupt the regime is, but then also at the same time they're actively trying to send intelligence to the Russians. So it's both things, and that's kind of different.
They had this two-way strategy to illuminate the Germans in Germany about stuff, because you only had propaganda media that were controlled by Goebbels. That's why these stickers, for example, they were quite interesting. We could just see them. They said in English, the Nazi paradise, Gestapo lies, war, hunger, how much longer? And in one May night, 1942, they glued these stickers, over 1,000 of them, onto the walls all over Berlin. So in the morning, quite a lot of people actually saw these stickers and realized that there is actually resistance, that there are people who think differently and who do something against the regime. So this was, Harro and Libertas thought, important to keep up that spirit or that idea that it is possible to think otherwise, to think differently. So you're actually right. They had this two-way strategy.
Some of the pamphlets they did, the stickers, other stuff they did. Obviously, this starts to draw some negative attention from the Gestapo, from the German authorities. And the Nazis eventually apply a name to this group, the Red Orchestra, which sounds like it's, makes it sound like it's sort of a very dangerous, organized, communist, Soviet-driven group of a sophisticated espionage group. And it's not exactly the case, is it? It's kind of more of a looser group of people, many of them artistic people, without a formal structure, without formal leadership, and without even really aside from the opposition to the Nazis, without really like an overall, I mean, they have a broad strategy that you've described, but not a very sort of specific driven goal in what they're doing.
Absolutely. The term Red Orchestra is a propaganda term that the Gestapo coined. The group itself wasn't even a group. I call it a network. Basically, it's a social network, because Harro's idea was, if we only allow people into our group of friends that are actually friends, then we're pretty safe from infiltration by the Gestapo, because the Gestapo was very good in infiltrating socialist and communist groups, for example, because the Gestapo guys would just, appear at the meetings and kind of find their way to the clandestine meeting and then just appear to be communist too, have the right, political conviction, which of course was fake, but still you could infiltrate those groups easier than a group where actually everyone knows everyone else and people become quite friendly also in their private lives. This was very important to Harro, so he recruited people through parties. They had bi-weekly parties in the loft of Harro and Libertas, where they would dance, laugh, sing, and love, and kiss, and flirt, and this was the way that they would, grow as a network, basically. So they were far from being communist spies. I mean, there were some communists in the group, but this was, back then there were, communism was actually like a way out of. It was considered very. It was a very honorable thing to be, I suppose, to be a communist. I mean, not by the Nazi standards, but Harrow had no problem talking to communists. But there were also other people that were against communism, or that didn't care about communism, or that had democratic ideas. Harrow was a Democrat. He was more of a left-wing guy, but he was certainly not a communist. So the Nazi tried to push them into a communist, kind of a McCarthy style. Like if you say something against the government, you're automatically a communist. So
right.
Obviously, was not the case for this group. But they did, for example, talk to the Soviets, because they said the Soviets are also the enemies of Hitler. So why wouldn't we talk to them? When Harrow learned in the Air Force Ministry that Germany would attack the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, he learned the date quite a bit of time earlier. So he informed the Soviets. He had a channel to get information to Moscow. And Stalin actually didn't believe in him, because he wasn't a communist spy. He was just some guy in Berlin who told him when the Soviet Union would be attacked. So Stalin was actually not believing this information, which was a big mistake Stalin did, because the Soviet Union was completely unprepared when the attack actually happened. He should have listened to Harrow.
Did Harrow say anything about how hard it was to get this vital information to the Soviet and or the British, and because they weren't very proactive in saying, "Oh, thanks very much." So was he frustrated by this, or was there any?
Yeah, I mean, they were especially frustrated with the Soviet Union, because there was one Russian guy who was an agent, and he always wanted to recruit Harrow and his friends, who always refused. But still, that guy knew that they have good information, so he was always trying to pass it on to Moscow. And in Moscow,
Right.
The information basically wasn't believed in. So this created obviously frustration in the group, because they said, "We have this information, we want to give it to you. Why don't you want to, learn from it?" Because Harrow also knew the way that the German army was advancing through the Soviet Union, which were the next targets. He knew when the army would split up and divide, and where would they go. So he was actually a very good source. Also, the British, it wasn't so easy to get to the British either, because the British always didn't want to be tricked by the Gestapo. The Gestapo behaving as if they were resistance fighters. So it was not easy actually for the group to get information out of Berlin to the Allies, but they kept trying, and they had success. I mean, it was also received, and it also helped the Allies against Hitler. But obviously, the group wanted a more direct communication, which was, of course, also difficult. During the war, it's not easy. You can't pick up the phone? They had a radio transmitter, but it was difficult to operate, and everything had to be decoded. So they had to, even though they weren't professionally trained spies, they had to learn all this stuff.
Yeah.
They had to learn how to live in a clandestine way, how to communicate in a coded way. So it was a steep learning curve, especially for Harrow, who did all the stuff and instructing his friends.
It's kind of wild to think about a group of people in Berlin in 1941, 42, who want to communicate with the British and the Soviets, and they have the information, and people don't want to listen, or they can't find a way to listen. It would be very frustrating for a movie maker, and I know you're also a screenwriter, to sort of make that into a movie, because there's a lot of inability to make that happen. That just must have driven everybody up a wall.
It's true, but it's also interesting to see actually how it works, and how they learn how to operate the radio, and how they learn how to code, and how the successful messages get through, and then what doesn't get through. And so it's a huge drama actually. So for the filmmaker, it's not such a big problem as it actually was for the people back then. They were really having problems. We could show their problems, and it's kind of interesting, really.
Let me bring in a question from one of our audience members, Nancy Nallens, who's obviously read your book because she is diving right in here. And she wants to know, what did you end up thinking about Libertas? It seems like she wasn't acting on principle as much as on her desire to stay with Harrow. And she also seemed to have very bad judgment, says Nancy. So what's your point of view on that?
I mean, yeah, Libertas is very interesting and maybe controversial. She's more controversial than Harrow because Harrow was pretty straight. He knew what he was doing. He was rational about it. He was cool about it. While Libertas was very hot about it. She was very emotional. She was afraid, much more afraid than he was. She wanted more than him even. She wanted to have a normal life. She wanted to enjoy life. She was highly intelligent. She wanted to be an artist. She didn't really want to be a resistance fighter, but she loved Harrow, who was sure that he would be in the resistance. So for her, it was really a difficult situation. And she struggled with it all the way till the end, like when she was in custody towards the end. She, in a way, not confessed, but, well, maybe you could say confessed. She confessed to a secretary of the Gestapo who told her that she would be a friend of Libertas. So the secretary said, "I'm not really part of the game here." When they were alone in the room, she said, "You can trust me. I can actually help you, and it's not going to look so bad for you anyhow. You're just Harrow's girlfriend." But actually, the secretary was like working for the Gestapo as well, and Libertas made the mistake of trusting the secretary. Gertrude Breiter was her name, too much. So she did actually have bad judgment in the end. And when she realized she'd been tricked by the secretary, she felt extremely bad, extremely embarrassed, obviously, because she put others in danger. So that's the drama of the last part of the book, how the people acted and reacted within Gestapo custody, which I thought was very interesting, because you can actually imagine yourself, being in Gestapo custody, because they were normal people like us, basically.
Right.
And suddenly they're sitting in the room with highly trained Gestapo officers who are not, just torturing you or, at what you would expect from the Gestapo. We're just, smart and friendly and talking to you, but I mean, very skilled interrogator. So it's very thrilling, I think, what happens in those months when they start to get captured, and because some got out by being even smarter than the Gestapo, and some didn't.
So Norman,
So having my drink.
Just me being quiet, Chris, and let me talk.
Huh?
I'm giving chance to Chris to talk because sometimes he complains that I won't shut up.
No.
So
we had a question from Neil Shara, and I'm going to wrap this into another question I had. This question is, does the group have any association with the White Rose resistance group? And I want to tack on to that and say, at least in America, we're familiar with Stauffenberg. Some people are more or less familiar with Sophie Scholl and the White Rose. Is there any coordination between all of these groups, or are they going off and doing their own things?
It's a very interesting question, because the German resistance is not just the White Rose and the Stauffenberg group. There were a few more groups. Harrow Libertas group is the biggest, but they come from different areas. Like the White Rose, these are students in Munich. Harrow and Libertas, these are intellectuals and artists in Berlin. And then Stauffenberg is the military people. So naturally, they're not connected. But when Harrow and Libertas were in the Gestapo prison, one of their friends who was not in Gestapo custody contacted Hans Scholl and met with the White Rose
Okay.
halfway between Berlin and Munich in the attempt to now fuse together all the resistance people in Germany to become a stronger, to form a strong union, which could make a change. And they also contacted the military people through Bonhoeffer, who was an important resistance guy, who also had contacts to the British. And in the end, it's very sad to say that the conservative, because the resistance was, the military resistance was more conservative resistance. They thought that the Nazis were basically losing the war, and that's why we have to resist against them. But they were like, even Stauffenberg, he was an anti-Semite, and he was basically for keeping conservative, capitalist, racist society in Germany. How libertarians were very much against that, wanted to stop persecution of the Jews. Also, the White Rose, they were working against the persecution of the Jews. But for example, the military people, they were not. This was not really their concern. They just wanted to get rid of Hitler because Hitler was doing a bad job as the commander-in-chief. So there were lots of points where groups did not agree, and in the end, the German resistance was unable to unite and was unable to speak with one voice or to act with one force. The resistance just kind of was, disintegrating, the group never could form. But there was friendship between the White Rose and this and the parts of How and Libertas Network that were not in prison.
Norman, we're having some trouble with your audio. We've gotten everything that you've said, but maybe you want to sort of drop out again and come back in again and see if that improves your audio a little bit. And we'll give you a moment to do that here. Just a reminder to everybody that we are, this is History Happy Hour, and Chris Anderson and I are hosting Norman Ohler, who is coming to us from a hotel room in Venice, and where maybe somebody else is using the internet at 10:30 at night in Venice. We don't know what they would be using it for, but perhaps that's the interference here. And Norman is back and joining us again. I wanted to ask you, your book is nonfiction, and it is clearly very well researched, very carefully put together, but it is not written like a history book. It's more like a novel about these interesting characters in this interesting time. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of why you chose to write it that way.
I like books that read well. And I think the challenge, is my audio good by now?
It's fair.
I try to be very simple in my answer.
We're doing okay.
Question. It's a complex question. It deserves a complex answer. For me, it was important to tell an authentic story, to not invent anything. So that's why I only report things when I have a source for it. At the same time, I'm a born novelist, basically. So I like to write in a novelistic style because I just think it reads better. And I think because I'm trying that it's my attempt that it reads better, and I think if it does read better, we get closer to the people, and we actually get to know their story and their lives in a better way. So I think it's the best of both worlds to research very thoroughly and not invent anything, but then use the facts that you have to paint a very lively picture. For example, if I know that Harrow was going to the train station on October 10th, 1941, I'm going to look up in a database what was the weather like on this day in Berlin. And if it rained the whole day, I know that it rained and that he gets wet when he walks across to the station, and I can describe this scene, and I can research what advertisements were being shown at the time at the station and what were the headlines of the newspaper that he walks by. And so I try to create a lively scene, which is what it's usually not what historians do, but I'm not a historian. I'm a novelist that works like a historian.
Well, if following up on that, what I found kind of fascinating were some of the little details, people about everyday life that people are living. Because if you sort of, especially in America, if you look at the movie version, it's all about, people on the run from the Gestapo or staff cars pulling up to large buildings with swastikas on them. Here it's about people going to the restaurant, going to the park, Harrow writing to his parents and saying, "Oh, the bombing's really not that bad. It's you can get used to it. It's not really that terrible thing," and you get this sense of everyday people who are living their lives, and slowly this encroaching darkness is kind of taking over everything. And it was just a very different view of wartime Berlin than I've seen in most other books, including Erik Larson's book, In the Belly of the Beast, which I think tries to do some of that stuff as well. But it really gives you a kind of a picture, even apart from the resistance group, of kind of living in Berlin at that time. And I thought that was well done.
Thank you. That was actually my attempt to paint a vivid picture of how life was in Berlin at the time. And I know Berlin very well, and I learned a lot about the so-called Third Reich while I researched Blitz, some of the world very well. So maybe it was easier for me to write a book than it would be, for example, for Erik Larson coming from outside into Berlin, because you have to understand the fabric of the city quite well to write a good book that's set in Berlin. Even though I think Larson also does a good job, he was one of the books that I kind of aspired to. So I'm happy that you put Bohemians in one level, or that you like my approach. That was what I was trying to achieve. I was interested in how did it actually feel for someone like me 70 years ago, living in that time in those times when suddenly society turns this way.
So Norman, this kind of gets into something that I've been curious about, and I know we get a lot of questions on our trips and from guests, and that is, what do the Germans know, and how much are they a part of this process, and why is there not more resistance? All these questions about German awareness and German guilt, and I just wanted to read a quote here from your book. And you say that every single person in the giant machine of the Reich who gains knowledge of this and nevertheless continues to participate thus becomes a murderer. And I was just I'd like to get some more of your thoughts about that. I know you touched a little bit about, your grandfather trying to describe the Reich, and people are curious about that. So kind of what's your take on all of that?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that Harrow and Libertas are not that known in Germany. I think it's telling, even though it's not supposed to be that way. We're supposed to be Germany is the world champion in certain things. We're world champion in soccer, often. We're world champion in baking bread. German bread is good. We're obviously world champions in making cars. Maybe now there's some electric American cars that are even better than our cars. We've invented cars. And usually when we're supposed to be the best at handling our terrible past, we take pride in knowing a lot about the Third Reich and being educated about it. But I think it's slowly getting less and less and less. People are not interested in it anymore. which also is connected to the rise of a new kind of right-wing movement in Germany and in other countries in Europe, obviously, but also in Germany, where we really should know better where this can lead to. So I think that, that's why it was interesting for me to write about how on Libertas, because they actually did something. So many Germans didn't do anything but contributed. I mean, this was obviously a modern, performance-driven capitalist society where everyone that took part in it was part of the war machine, and hundreds of thousands were part of the genocide machine. So this is nothing new. I mean, but it's just interesting or frightening, or to realize that or to talk about that. And I think it's very important that, I mean, I wouldn't say that my books are very important, but I think it is actually important that books on the subject are being published, because people like my grandfather who could still talk about these times, they are dead now. There's hardly any people left that actually saw what happened. So we more and more depend on cultural artifacts like books. So that was probably the motive why I wrote this story.
Well, and speaking about cultural artifacts, I just wanted to ask you, well, this might be a little specific, but you mentioned an exhibit in your book called Crimes of the Wehrmacht, and you mentioned that Libertas had been kind of working on something similar to that with her collections of photographs of soldiers sent to Russia. And just because it's something that I try to explain to my guests about Wehrmacht guilt versus SS guilt and all these other things, could you just briefly tell the audience about what the exhibit Crimes of the Wehrmacht was about?
Well, it was created by Reemtsma, who is a leftist kind of a very rich person actually in Germany, but a leftist scholar, and he designed the exhibit Crimes of the Wehrmacht, which was an exhibition where you would go to and see photographs basically and get information. It was shown in major cities in Germany. I would have to look up when it was actually first shown, but I would say maybe 15 years ago it was put up at the time. Yeah. And this was actually for the first time in German post-war reality that people realized that the Wehrmacht, which was not part of the Nazi party, but it was the regular army of Germany. The Wehrmacht is just a name for the army of Germany. That the army of Germany, the military of Germany, was actually committing war crimes. Before that, it was not that known. So that exhibit actually changed the consciousness of the German population about what actually the army did. Because before that, you could say, many people would say, yeah, the army, they were just the army. They did, what any army of any country does in a war. They try to win, they lead their battles, whatever. The bad guys are the Nazis. But that exhibit actually shows that the Wehrmacht was becoming also an institution that committed, horrible crimes. And Libertas had realized this already in the 1940, 41, 42, because she was working for the German, what's it called, in how would I translate it into English?
The Film Culture Office?
Yeah, right, the Film Culture Office, where documentary films were being censored, basically. So she was working in that censorship institution that was part of Goebbels' propaganda ministry. And there she saw a lot of documentary footage from the Eastern Front, and she collected the footage that showed crimes that the Wehrmacht was committing. So she was basically doing the same work that Reemtsma, the leftist guy, did 65 years later. So I thought that was quite interesting.
we're having a continued problem with your audio. Again, I think we've heard everything you've had to say so far, which I'm enjoying following. And I'm going to just actually suggest that you go as far as quitting out of your browser and then, or even closing your computer for a moment and let it reestablish its Wi-Fi connection. So if we get full audio, Norman, for the last 10 minutes, it'll just be better. So I'm willing to sacrifice a minute or two to that if you want to give that a shot. And we'll just do that. And Norman, if you can just drop out and try to close your computer, open it up again, and rejoin us, I think that will hopefully make things better. Chris, I hope you appreciated there that you start to read one single quote from the book. And
I did.
I threw that quote up on the screen, and let me say to the audience, we didn't talk about that quote.
But we are so simpatico, Rick.
We both focused in on the same one paragraph from the book. So that is a total fist bump. Boom. Yep. To the camera. Boom. Find the camera, Chris. Okay.
There we go. Boom.
Okay. Close enough. So Norman's trying to join us back again. And now, of course, we are talking with Norman Ohler who's from Berlin, but who's in Venice right now and is having a little trouble, I think, getting to us because I just see white here. I don't know, and I don't see any audio. I don't see his audio clicking, so I'm assuming he's not there. I'm going to just check it out here. What the heck? We might as well expose all the inner workings of History Happy Hour to the world, right?
On the Greek machine.
So, Norman, we see black here, but do you hear us?
I can hear you quite well. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, quite well.
So I'm going to remove your picture because we don't see anything, and we're just going to listen to you.
Just a Black Lives Matter statement by myself.
Be very careful. So this story. So actually, let me go back to one other question here from our audience, and boom, he's gone. So I love the internet. Although I have to say, I mean, growing up as I did in the 60s and 70s, the idea that we could, do our own impromptu international networks. And Norman, this isn't even the worst that's happened. So, you're totally cool. We're with you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
You're not frozen. We have audio and video. Tell the people in the next room to stop watching their movie. So, just a joke. So Phil Brzezinski wants to know, were there any Wehrmacht officers involved with this group? And of course, Harrow was a Luftwaffe officer, but there was at least one other military person involved in the group, wasn't there?
Who was that?
Well, okay, maybe there wasn't, but I was thinking of the person who did the radio direction finding.
Oh, well, there was
military.
There was Hans Koppy, the radio operator. He was in the military, but he wasn't an officer. There was Arvid Harnack, who was a good friend. I don't know if there was another officer, actually.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm sure a lot of these people had done military service just because.
Yeah, basically all the men were military.
Yeah.
Everyone had to be a soldier. It was very hard not to be one. But Harrow was the highest ranking officer. So,
okay. Let me pivot here and say, in what ways this network was kind of purposefully mischaracterized after the war, especially in the Soviet Union and East Germany, kind of for their own political purposes, wasn't it?
That's true. I mean, there was a lot of propaganda against the group during the war by the Gestapo. They were called communist spies. And the funny thing is that after the war, the Soviet Union continued with that legend and said, yeah, they were communist spies. We had a group operating in Nazi Berlin. And the Western intelligence, American intelligence, actually bought it. I don't know if bought is the right word. Used that term as well, and said, "Yeah, see, that's how dangerous communist communist spying is." They even had a group in Nazi Berlin, and they're probably continuing now having their groups everywhere. So in the emerging Cold War, the group around Haro and Libertas continued to be seen as a communist spy ring.
And Norman, so is that why you think that of all the German resistance groups, they aren't as well known as some of the others?
Yeah, I think that is the reason. I was in the house of Haro's brother a few years ago. He actually grew quite old. Hartmut is his name. He's also in the book because he always wanted to join the group, and Haro kind of kept him out. Probably saved his life. But when I was visiting Hartmut a few years ago, he showed me a letter that he had sent to the German Chancellor Kohl, who was the chancellor before Merkel, there was Schröder, and before Schröder, there was Kohl. He was the chancellor of the German reunification. And Hartmut had written letters to Kohl, because Hartmut had been an ambassador of Western Germany, so he was quite high up in the West Germany society. He had sent letters to Kohl saying, "Listen, my brother was not a communist. Can't we accept him now? Can't Germany accept him into the,
pantheon or
give him the honor of accepting him as a resistance fighter?" And Kohl actually
right.
that this is not possible. We cannot let people like this. We cannot honor people like this. I don't know, what was your question? I totally forgot your question, but I hope I somehow...
Well, just why Haro's group, why they seem to not get the attention.
The reason why. I gave the example that the German chancellor didn't accept them because he still thought they're actually communist spies.
Right, and it was interesting to me that, and I mean, I don't think I'm giving anything away about the ending of your book to say that it doesn't end well for a lot of the people in this circle. But it's interesting that some of the officials who are interrogating them, tracking them down, prosecuting them, seeing them get executed, go to work for the United States, go to work for the German government. I think some even maybe go to work for Russia. I'm not positive of that. They seem to do much better in the immediate post-war environment, those people who were supporting the Nazis in this case, than did the people who were resisting the Nazis.
Yeah, it's a sad post-war chapter. And especially the United States was very interested and happy to use Nazi personnel in order to learn a lot actually about the dictatorship and how it operated, its people, how it controlled its people. CIA was very interested in that, the emerging CIA, the OSS before. Also they were using, especially the Western allies, and especially the United States, were using a lot of Nazi people to reorganize German life and bring order to post-war Germany. And this obviously created a lot of frustration amongst people who had been fighting or had been opposed to the Nazis. And now, for example, some people from Haro's group that survived tried to prosecute the prosecutor that had sent their friends to their deaths, and they were not successful because he was protected by his friends who were still running the courts in Germany. So especially the judicial branch was infested with Nazis for quite some time. This actually was one of the reasons for the German Cultural Revolution in '68. This was the left-wing students in Germany said it has to stop, that all the old Nazis are still running the show here in Germany. We have to rise up against that.
So Norman, one of the questions, or something I would like your opinion on. All of these German resistance groups are very, very small. They don't coordinate very well with one another. Ultimately, they fail, but they still try. So, is the importance of Harrow's group and the other groups, is it what they accomplished during the war, or is it more important for Germans after the war to say there were some of us who said no?
I think it's very important for the people afterwards to see that there actually was a resistance. I think it would be horrible if there had been none. It would be quite depressing, actually.
Right.
So I think it was good that they did what they did, even though they paid a high price for it. They kind of proved that there was a conscience that was not suppressed. This is, for example, the symbol of Sophie Scholl,
right,
the young woman who just says what she feels and who's not afraid to say what she feels and even die for it. I think it's important that these people exist in times like that. But, as I said, they paid a high price for it. They did give relevant information to the Allies, but did it really help? I mean, it helped the Allies. The Allies won, but the Allies would have won also without that information.
Right.
So I mean, sometimes it's even amateurish if you look at what they did. I mean, against such a strong regime, they posted some leaflets on the walls. Right. It's nothing, you can't, stop this machine. The Nazi machine was very, very strong. It was a very strong, system. Yeah. But they just couldn't shut up. They just had to do something. And I mean, not always, obviously, but sometimes I wonder what would I have done if
we all wonder that.
I would have been against the system. I don't even know if I would have been against the system, because there's no way of knowing how your consciousness would be during those times. But let's say you were against the system. What do you do? Do you do nothing? Or do you leave the country? Or do you do something like Harrow and Libertas? It's very hard to say, but that's why it's so interesting to examine them.
And relevant to today.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Norman Ohler, thank you so much for braving the internet and joining us from the lovely canal city of Venice, Italy. Norman Ohler is the author of Bohemians in the United States, the lovers who led Germany's resistance against the Nazis. It's called The Infiltrators if you're in the UK, and I don't know what it's called in any other language. But Norman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Norman.
It was a pleasure. I'm sorry about the internet. I chose a very good hotel, but I'm in Italy. What can you say? The food's good.
By Italian standards, it was outstanding.
I think it's a fair trade-off. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.
Okay. Well, Chris, we survived the vicissitudes of the internet tonight, and I think it worked out pretty well. You had a history happened here for us, I think, related to the conversation we were just having. Yeah. I'm not sure it actually happened here, but it happened someplace around, and we have a statue here, photo you sent me. Who is this?
This is a statue of Sophie Scholl, who was involved in the White Rose, the resistance movement in Munich, and she was a very courageous young woman who, along with several other students, wrote a series of pamphlets in opposition to what was happening. And they were students at Munich University, and they wrote up these anti-Nazi pamphlets, mostly to try to raise the awareness of people in Germany as to what was happening. And they would throw them from the corridors of the school just as the classes were letting out, so the students would see them and pick them up. They were caught after the 6th pamphlet, and Sophie and the other members of the White Rose Resistance were murdered by the Nazis. She was 21 years old, and that bust is in the hall, I guess you'd say, at Munich University, where she threw her last pamphlet from the window, and we saw it on one of our trips.
Well, it is an amazing story, the story of the resistance, and I'm kind of with Norman on this. You wonder what you would do if put in that set of circumstances, and something that we barely got to talk about is that this resistance group, the in Berlin with Harrow and Libertas, their prosecution and everything, it was this is not something that was done at a low level. This is something that if Hitler didn't personally direct it, he came darn close to directing the persecution and prosecution of this unit. And of course, Goering had to be involved in it because he had egg on his face for having promoted Harrow and made him a lieutenant.
Absolutely.
So he was going to make
and also helping being either walking Libertas down the aisle or being a witness at Libertas's wedding. So so
he wanted to make sure that these guys got exterminated so that there was nothing left on him, and a great effort to destroy all the evidence, to basically make it as if they had never been done anything at all, which of course eventually failed. So again, thank you to Norman Ohler and his book, The Bohemians. We are so glad that he joined us tonight. And next week we have, Chris, one of my favorite authors of all time. I am probably not even going to sleep.
Me?
The other one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Hampton Sides is going to talk to us. His book is called Breakout. He's going to talk to us about the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. But he is literally probably my favorite nonfiction author. And so I will probably do a lot of blubbering and fanboy behavior during the interview.
Outstanding.
I'm apologizing for it now.
I can't wait to watch this.
It's going to be like, please answer my question.
Should I send him an email before the show and say, could you just mention the Ghost Army once?
Oh, I don't think he'll have any problem mentioning the Ghost Army, but he also, Hampton, and irrespective of the fact that he's one of my favorite authors, he did also write a blurb for one of my books. So, I was in seventh heaven on that day as well, but looking forward to that. And it's been another fun History Happy Hour. Thank you so much, everybody from all around the world who joined us. And thank you for putting up with some audio issues, but I hope you could understand most of it. It was really, really fascinating. And we really appreciate you being with us.
Thanks, everybody.